It is Tuesday, August 18th, and this is a bi-weekly Zoom call for the Special Fathers Network. I'm thrilled today to be doing the Zoom call on the topic of housing and alternative living arrangements. And we've got two of our dads, more of our seasoned dads, who've been around the track a couple times, and they've had to face the issue of what to do with their son, or in some cases sons, in housing. So the first up will be Paul Koza, and then the second up will be Rich Gathro. So I'd like to ask each of you to make some brief introductory remarks, and then we'll get back to the topic at hand, and then you'll each come back and make some brief presentations about what your experience has been with housing and alternative living arrangements, and then we'll open up for Q&A. So Paul, the Zoom stage is yours.
My name is Paul Koza. I have four sons. I've been married for 42 years to my wonderful wife, Maureen. I am retired. I was a sales executive for Amgen for 25 years, Baxter for 10 years, Alpha Corporation, and petroleum chemicals, and I actually taught high school right out of college and coached football and track. So that's my life story. My boys, Brian is 36. And we went for the girl and got three more boys. And that was Kevin, Sean, and Dan, and they're 32 years old, triplets. Kevin is healthy. He's got my two beautiful granddaughters, and just got promoted to sales director, so I'm very happy for him. And my other son, Brian, actually works for Amgen, and he's a sales rep as well. He's got my two wonderful grandsons. Unfortunately, we just got back from Columbus because my youngest turned one, youngest grandson. So I got a 4, 3, 2, and 1. And our son drove in from Charlotte to Columbus, and we drove into Columbus and had a wonderful long weekend. We hadn't seen the girls for 4 months. We hadn't seen the guys up until last thing for 8 months. So you can imagine that's just very painful. So two of my sons, Dan and Sean, are autistic. And they were diagnosed with autism at about 18 months, the classic, diagnosis of autism, although they're not really verbal. They're big guys. They look a lot like me, but they're docile. They're wonderful guys. They're very easy to manage. And, that's basically the whole premise of this tonight, is to talk about what was our plan for them. You get handed triplets. Statistics say that if you have multiples, you're likely to be divorced 50%. If you have disabled, you're likely to be divorced at 50%. You have multiples, so a lot of statistics against us, but we're proof that, hey, if you love your kids and your kids love you back, you can do anything. So I think that's about where I'll end it and hand it over to Rich, right?
Thank you, Paul. Rich, over to you now.
Rich Gathro, married to Kathy, 42 years, two children. My son Will is 35, my daughter Katie's 31. Will has a rare disorder called schizencephaly that appears like cerebral palsy, so it could be, it's like saying the word cancer. It covers a lot of things, cerebral palsy, but it's actually called schizencephaly. It was a genetic disorder. We currently live in Florida. Prior to that, we lived in the Washington, D.C. area for over 40 years. I'm a career educator in background. I retired 5 years ago. Was college dean, was a professor, was an education association administrator. One of the great ironies is my kids could have gone to college for free, but both of them having some disabilities. Not my daughter at least was able to finish community college. But I want to say, David, thank you for establishing this network. Thank you for doing this.
Well, thank you for that brief introduction. And so those are the credentials. These guys are both very seasoned veterans as relates to special needs, and we're thrilled to have them as part of the Special Fathers Network. So the topic for tonight is housing and alternative living situations. And obviously, we're only going to cover a small portion of what that entails. but these guys are going to speak from their own personal experience, what it was like in anticipation of their coincidentally, son's housing needs. And Paul, yours is more prospective, and Rich, because Will has been, out of the nest, if you will, for quite a few years in a number of different situations. You have a little bit different angle on all this. So we're going to switch the order up. Rich, I'm going to let you go first, and then Paul will get back to you, and then we'll open it up to questions. And like I had said, if you do have questions, you can put them in the chat, or when we get to the end, we can just call on people who raise their hands. So Rich, back to you.
First of all, say on the stress or concern scale, apart from diagnosis, medical care, and the education of our children, the lingering issue that shows up pretty soon in your minds is what's going to happen to my child when I'm gone or no longer capable of taking care of him. So it's a stressful issue and a difficult issue. Here in Florida, where we now live, and my son does now live with me. I'll talk about in a minute that he lived 10 years in a group home situation. There are close to 500,000 young adults or adults with disabilities in the system, quote unquote. And it's fascinating that something like 372,000 of those, close to 500,000, live with their families. Gives a certain perspective. There's a number, of course, options. I like to categorize them in 5 areas. For those of you that are trying to think ahead about housing options for your children, there's, in addition to the number 1 option, of course, them living with you until you no longer can care for them. There's also the option of family picking up on them when you're gone, or in my case, I set up a mentor relationship with my son, with a local business friend, and he and his wife have now said, anything ever happens to you, we'll take Will, his mentor. And he's the executor of our estate. And of course, the conversation about estates and trusts and so forth, that's a whole other category of discussion. But in addition to those options, of course, there's the public option with the state providing housing or assisted housing from the federal government, Section 8, Section 811 is it called. You may want to explore online what the government options are. One of them that can be very helpful is there is some assistance available for a semi-independent disabled adult available through the government. I, for one, have seen enough of the government options that I'm not particularly excited about my son ever being tied into those, both state and federal. Obviously, they're a safety net and well-intended and everything else, but not always the best living situation, frankly. And through Special Olympics, I encountered a lot of young adults in the government options and saw the conditions in which they lived, the kind of care they received. And again, if it's a safety net, if you're up against the wall, it's an option, but I don't particularly recommend it. Then there's the private options. The ARC of each state often has housing situations. Here locally, very close to where we live, there's an Association of Retired Citizens Center, and they have quite a few housing options, and they're offering education, training, so forth. It's worth looking at. Then there's a variety of private homes, My son was in a place called Cornerstone in McKinney, Texas, a very godly, caring community who had powerfully engaged McKinney as a town in supporting them. And again, he lived there 10 years. The staff was wonderful. But I'll talk a little bit about this a little more, a term called neurodiversity. It's very easy to lump disabilities together in ways that aren't appropriate. And my son was in an environment where ultimately they asked him to leave. He felt ultimately he kept growing. Now he has mild MR and he has limited physical ability, but he kept growing as a person, and he sort of outgrew the wonderful facility. All the other residents were docile, very cooperative, and he started writing us and saying, "I think I'm in a penitentiary," because everything was so programmed. You know, they said, "We're going to go get hamburgers tonight," and he'd say, "Well, I feel like having a pizza." I mean, so it ultimately broke down, and they informed us that he was to leave, that they didn't feel he could care for him, which was a major adjustment for us, and thus he lives with us now. But there's some good organizations out there. I wanted to mention Marbridge. I don't know if you've all heard of that, but Marbridge is located outside of Austin, Texas. And they offer, it's a wonderful village that offers much more wider range than Cornerstone Group Home in Texas would have offered. They have villas where there's 6 bedrooms and 3 baths and semi-independence, but they also have advanced care and nursing care for that diversity. But the problem is cost. $3,700 a month. But it's a beautiful place. If you have the means, it's a place to consider. The last option I want to talk about is something new that we've sort of come across called Neurodiverse CoHousing. Have any of you ever heard of that? Neurodiverse CoHousing? It's rooted in a movement in Denmark in what's simply called co-housing, where people say, we believe in community, we want to have our own independence, but we want to know our neighbor. Studies show that half of America doesn't know its next door neighbor, sadly. Enormous loneliness in America, particularly in the disability community. But it started there, where the idea was, and there's scores of these now in the United States of co-housing, not neurodiverse co-housing like I'm going to talk about. But you live in this community where you have your own private living situation. It can be a fair amount of space or a limited amount of space, but you share space as well. Meals, 4 or 5 nights a week, a workshop for those who want to work with wood. You share. You come home from work, and you know everyone. You're looking out for each other. If someone's not showing up, everyone knows and responds. They're living in community together. This thing called co-housing. Co-housing is really a community partnership. You own your own little house. People come together in a partnership and develop that. But there's a group that we've encountered here in Florida called OneKinRoof, or roof, depending what part of the country you're from. Kin, K-I-N, one, O-N-E, kinroof.org is the site. I'd encourage you to go to that site. There's an 1 and 30-minute introduction to the idea of neurodiverse housing. OneKinRoof is trying to bring families with special needs children together to care for each other. Again, this is not communism. It's you have your own space, but the idea is you're looking out after each other. And we've tied into OneKinRoof. I'd like you to check it out, and it's a newer concept. When we say neurodiverse, it recognizes the diversity of disabilities that we ran into at Cornerstone, where Will was no longer a fit. And it's really participant-led. You know, there's provider-controlled housing, like Cornerstone was. They controlled almost everything, including counseling and training and so forth, or government housing. But there's also the possibility of consumer-controlled housing, like I'm suggesting with Neurodiverse CoHousing. But they talk about an experiment of this called Frog Song in Sonoma, California. It's supposedly functioning well. Again, I'm new to this, but I wanted to present in my opening speech the five, have something to put our heads around, the five categories of us taking care of them: family and friends, public, private, or this thing called neurodiverse co-housing. We all know that our children face a level of potential loneliness that we don't necessarily face with neurotypical lives. And that's what's attracting me to this concept of neurodiverse housing, where I don't want my son to ever be lonely. So that gives you some of my experience. The experience, I just would add some emotional piece to it. The experience of having your son a couple thousand miles away, very painful for him and for us. It was the best place we could find, but that was very painful for us to always be dropping him off. We'd bring him home 3 times a year for a week or so, or we'd go down there for a week or whatever. But some sort of housing arrangement where you can at least see each other on a weekend or whatever, like your kid's away from college or something, but you're really connecting, is more powerful for me. I just remember the pain he felt, the pain we felt in separation. Another emotional thought that I keep thinking about is us, males. We here in where we are in Pinellas County, Tampa, St. Pete, Florida, there's a number of programs for young adults with disabilities, middle-aged adults with disabilities, but only the mothers tend to show up. I'm tempted to call, when I go to some of these events, there's a group called HUG, which is called Help Us Gather. I'm often the only father that shows up. This is an issue. It's a separate topic in some ways, but I want to throw it into the conversation. Our sons and daughters need us. It's just not only my wife's responsibility, who bears it more deeply than I do because of the female brain who operates 24/7, but we males need to be involved. Those are some of my opening thoughts.
Rich, thank you for that very thorough and enlightening presentation. I really appreciate it. I know we'll come back to this in the Q&A, but one of the things I find unique about your story is that you went through the process of evaluating what was in Will's best interest. He was someplace, and for quite a few years, most of those 10 years, it was a glove in hand type of experience. As far as his experience, despite the distance and some of the other challenges that might have gone along. And then, it's sort of like a boomerang, right? Maybe you didn't see that coming. And I'd like to get into that a little bit, the way that you and your wife handled that. But before we do that, I'd like to turn it back to you, Paul. Yours is more of a prospective experience because you're just on the cusp of finding the solution for your boys. And what I'd like you to emphasize too is the runway, the time frame that's been leading up to what you and your wife have been doing. So back
Sure.
to you.
Sure. So, and thank you, Rich. And just in going back to Rich, I've explored, read, listened, looked at a lot of the types of places that Rich just described, whether it was in Texas, Illinois, Arizona has a community, San Francisco. There are these things that exist. And my company was California based. I kept avoiding trying to go to California, but at the end of the day, there were probably options in California. I took my wife and I, first you get handed triplets, then you find out that two are disabled, and you're trying to say, how can we lead as much of a normal life with two disabled, but we're always, as Rich said, in the back of your mind, what's going to happen? What, God forbid something happens to us, what happens? So the one thing I want to start out with is you've got to have a plan. And it doesn't mean you have this big financial plan, but you have to have a plan as to what you're going to do. And Rich mentioned it early. I mean, early on, I'm just looking at my notes. I said that we had a short-term, near-term plan and the long-term plan. The short-term plan certainly going to include their health. How are you going to cover their health costs? What do you have to deal with? Their education. Is their disability so great that they can't use the local state stuff, or can you tap into state disability? We were fortunate enough to get into a special needs state program. So really from the time they were diagnosed at 3, we had a diagnosis at Special Education of Lake County at 3, they got enrolled in that program. Both of them. Very different. They were in different types of programs, even though they're both classed autistic. Autism is a huge, broad spectrum. So Dan and Sean went their separate ways through a grade school program, through a high school program, and then through a transition program. So basically you got your 8 years, your 4 years, and then you've got 4 more years, but at 22, you fall off the cliff, because they return to you and there's no support, and you got to have a plan at that point. So, you're constantly looking. When Sean turned 18, there was a community, a place called Riverside that had an empty bed, and they said Sean's disability was, he was lower functioning. Would we consider moving Sean into that? And my wife and I were not ready. We were just not ready to say, oh my God, one day we're putting him in bed, hugging him, talking to him, and we're not going to drop them off. So we kind of ruled out the large institution thing. So the next thing I said is Dan was having a lot of challenges. Hormones kicked in at 18. When he went through transition, they were putting him on a local bus. They were sending him to a community thing that they said, hey, this will work well. Well, the economy had gone in the dumper in like 2008, just about the time that these guys were finishing their transitions. And they were saying, can you send puzzles? Because he's in a cube all day and we really need him for him to do something. We don't have any piecemeal work for him. Well, naturally, he's coming home angry and everything. And I said, what can we do? We identified 2 private organizations. One was Center for Enriched Living, and one was Special Rec of Lake County. So from the time they've been 22 till now, for 10 years, they've been able to go every other day. We kind of flip them. We don't want them in the same programs. And my wife was driving until I retired. Then I became a full-time driver, But the reason I'm leading up to this is, okay, so that's their daily life, right? They either go to the Center for Enriched Living from 10 to 3 or Special Rec of Lake County. And on the weekends, they might go to a dance. So I said, can we build a life around this? Well, CEL's been in business for 50 years. Special Rec's been around for 50 years with the intent that these things are going to go. Now, the coronavirus has put a damper on everything in everybody's life, but we're all making it. So anyway, I said, what model can we build? Can we get a group home? Because as Rich mentioned, you've got housing of independent living, you've got small group homes, you have large group homes, you have disabled complexes and disabled communities. That's the 5 buckets that I listed. And the one that we chose was a small community home. But we said there were organizations in Illinois that did this. Clearbrook, 42 homes. Glenkirk, 21 homes. But as I looked into it, David, like you said, because you're state funded, you were finding that the only way they could function is if they had a 4-bedroom home, they were putting 2 people in a room. You'd have 8 people in a room with 2 caregivers, quality of life, pressures. You have such diverse disabilities, the stresses. It was just too much. And my wife said, no, we can't do that. Can we do something for ourselves? And I'm looking at, it's impossible to fund this. So, but we kept listening to our community alternatives person who in Illinois, or probably everywhere, you have independent service coordination agencies. These agencies kind of handle your state funding. And our agent had been with us for a long time, since the boys were 18. And she said, you really need to look into this group called Activisions. It was 2 women who started their own independent group home organization because they didn't like the way these other ones were handled. And they had 20 homes. And they really only had 2 to 3 people in these homes. They still tapped into the state funding. So she signed us up for, in Illinois, what's called PUNS funding. PUNS funding is funding that's going to allow a person to move into a group home. As Rich said, 500,000 in Florida, 250,000 disabled in Illinois. 30,000 are on the PUNS list, and 900, it used to be 500, now it's 900 are eligible to be drawn every year. And when these people are drawn, there's still nowhere for them to go, really, because there's no real homes available. So we said, if we got a home, and we went to Activisions, if we got our own home, bought a home, would you guys be able to staff it? They said yes. So now we had to find out where we were. We had signed the boys up on the PUNS list at 18. And here it is 13 years later, or 14 years later, and we're still not hearing anything. And kind of through some luck and serendipity, Autism Now had a bill in the state, and I started tracking who was on the bill, who was our local representative, made a connection with the director of disabilities, and found out my guys were on the list for 3 years. Then they had been moved to a planning section, and then they got back on it. And she said, well, you guys only have 54 months of tenure on this list. I said, well, wait a minute. We've been on the thing for 13 years. Where are we? You got 2 guys. Did you see Koza? And it's funny, the criteria for this type of list had crisis, critical, and emergency. What's the difference, right? So we finally, I had a chance to talk with the director of disabilities of the state, explain to him that, we've been on this list a long time. And lo and behold, with our months of tenure, we were pulled last year. So what does that mean? Well, that means you're going to get a letter saying you're going to get state funding, either for planning or for utilization. We were in the utilization category, and that's only if the state budget is passed to allow for it. Well, that happened. So last summer, we knew we were going to get this funding. So we went to the agency and we said, what do we need to do? And they said, well, you need to have a house. You got to have a house. Once you have a house, we can apply for the funding. So we bought the house and we closed on January 27th. They applied and the state sent us our grant money. Surprised the hell out of us. It was like $87,000 per guy. And one of the guys in Dan's program, Joey McCullough, also an autistic, he came from a family of 8, and he had funding for 9 years because they couldn't find a place for him. We approached that family and we said, would Joey want to be a roommate? And so Joey is going to be the roommate. So we were thinking March 1st, we'd have the house, we'd hire staff. They were ready to go. They hired their first person March 6th to be the full-time person. The way it works is you hire somebody that starts at 2 in the afternoon and they work till 10 at night. Then you have 6 part-time people that work 12-hour shifts every other day. So it's pretty crazy. But what these guys, so here's what our typical day was going to be. The guys would be living at the house. They would, be showered in the morning, breakfast, lunch, go to their programs, their existing programs, CEL, SRA, and Joey was in the same thing. Come home at night, they have a new caregiver, makes dinner, gives them a shower, puts them to bed. The thing about autistic guys in a house, you don't want open concept. So we bought a 1950 ranch house, fantastic. We painted it. We have it. It's in a wonderful neighborhood. It's 3 miles from here, south of the high school. At first, we didn't know. We've met all the neighbors, and they're wonderful. They understand. So we felt really good. Once the coronavirus hits, we can't staff the house, but we start to make a little progress, and then all the programs are shut down. So that's my story. I have a beautiful house 3 miles away. I have 3 guys that are ready to move in. I have an agency that's hired 2 people and kind of stockpiled our 2 caregivers in 3 of their other houses in a community not far away in Highland Park, and they're going to be ready. The only thing, as I was preparing for tonight, that made me nervous is I was looking at the letter from the state. I've got it right here, and it basically states that from the time I was awarded this, which was March 9th, I have 6 months to operate. So technically, according to the letter, September 9th, we got to be fully staffed and running. I've talked to Activisions, I've talked to Community Alternatives, and they said, no, you haven't executed that yet. I just don't want to get caught in that kind of a mess. So going back, if I can be of value to people, the thing that I simply say is, you have this plan, what's your vision? And can you keep charging at this vision and keeping your mind open to it? Can you tap into the resources like the center, like Special Rec, to understand what are alternatives? And we looked at some of the little group homes that are in the area, and we felt like that's going to be something long-term, that we're going to be able to work with. So in Illinois, we have ARC. ARC tells you once you enroll, they give you the pathway, and I'll show it to you here. And that just kind of walks you through it. So the ARC is finding your way in the LIGUS, it's called the LIGUS Family Advocate Program in Illinois. But if you can pull families together, you can do this as well. And, we're kind of a godsend to this other family. They have 8 children, and they adopted Joey from Romania, knowing he was autistic. They went to Europe and adopted him. All of their children are from, they have 3 from China, they have 2 from Africa, they have a mixed race, and they have a couple kids from in the States. So we said, okay, we'll take Joey. So we've had some sleepovers, but we haven't been able to do anything else. So I can provide, David, you with this information for an Illinois-based group home planning and the agencies that are available. I don't want to disparage Clearbrook or Glenkirk or any of those. All those places are doing a great job. Brian Rubin's heavily involved in that. But the only thing that I could say is, as a parent of a disabled person, you got to have a plan, you got to have a budget, and you've got to continue to churn that and update it. We really thought we were going to send Dan and Sean to a place in Texas. We really looked at it. My son lived in Dallas for 8 years, and we thought, well, maybe we'll move to Dallas, And right now, we ended up, my mom is 96 in a nursing home. My wife's mom's 92 in a nursing home. So we still got, we're still caring for seniors. We've got our guys. So we figure once the boys are in their house, we'll kind of downsize from our house. And we've got our grandkids in Charlotte that we'd like to see a little bit more, and our grandkids in Columbus. We used to spend a month in Florida with the boys, and that's still part of it. We're going to be the renting vagabonds as soon as we get the boys in their house, But I have quite a few documents, David, to be specific on how you can drive this. Illinois, obviously different from Florida, obviously different from Michigan, from every other state. But each state has its own agencies, and you got to tap into those agencies.
Paul, thank you for making another enlightening presentation. And as I was reflecting on the stories that you just told, the story that Rich told, and the other stories that I've heard from dads in the network, it's like you hear about autism. If you know one person with autism, you know one person with autism.
True.
And if you listen to these stories, there's some similarities from case to case, if you will, but everybody's situation is different. We're talking about like at least 3 different levels. There's the physical aspect, local versus distant. There's the financial aspect, which is what can we afford? How much support can we get from the state, et cetera? And then there's the emotional aspect, Rich, like you were talking about, which is, are they ready, right? Are we ready? And is there ever a time that people are ready? And how do you deal with the distance, right? Whether it's nearby or a longer distance. So I've got 101 questions that are coming to my mind. And I'd like to just lead the Q&A off by saying, maybe try to keep the answers as brief as possible. Rich, you first, and then Paul. How do you know that you and your spouse are on the same page and the time is right? Could you reflect a little bit on that and what your own personal experience was?
It requires constant conversation and constant back and forth. I'm blessed with a very bright, capable, astute wife who is an educator as well. Constant dialogue. But as Paul mentioned, when you're starting to face that age 22, you better plan well before you hit that age 22. What are you going to do? How do you keep this child stimulated, involved, having companions, being in a community? It requires a lot of accountability. One of the things I've observed most, I first observed it coaching Challenger Division Little League in the county we were living in. We started a Little League division called Challenger, and I was a coach. There's a temptation for one parent, if it's a 2-parent family, of taking over and doing everything. I saw that particularly coaching Little League of all things. It requires a lot of cooperation because of the emotional stress, the financial stress, a lot of accountability. And Kathy and I hold an annual retreat every year, a very comprehensive annual retreat. In fact, some of the guys in one of our conversations had me give my list of topics for our retreat. But it's a planning retreat where we review the past year and look at the year ahead. And we're uninterrupted. Kids are taken care of, and we spend 2 days planning. And that's been very critical to us. We've been doing it since the 80s. And we find a good place to retreat where you're comfortable. You don't worry about your meals, and you really sit down and go to work. But you sleep well as well. You recreate a little bit, but you do your planning and you write down your goals and objectives. You have a strategic plan, a mission statement, a strategic plan, just like a company would have.
Yeah. Anything else, Rich?
That's good.
Okay. No, I think that's fantastic. I mean, just like Rich said, I'm blessed with an incredible better half. And Maureen, if you think about it, I was a sales director with a California-based company, and I had regions for 16 years. I had half the country, quarter of the country, this, that, and the other. So I was constantly traveling. But I coached Challenger baseball. I coached youth football. I was part of the Special Olympics, but it wasn't only the sports side. And my other 2 sons won state football and lacrosse championships. So we had a lot going on. But what we focused our guys on, we made sure that Dan and Sean weren't separate from Brian and Kevin, even in the early days. So Kevin have a Little League game. I made sure Dan and Sean had a Little League game that day too, the Challenger game. Maureen, incredibly scheduling. We have a giant calendar that Dan just every day points to it still, and we all live off of it. I said, I don't know what I'm going to do. I use my phone, but I still look at the big calendar. What do we got today? Because she tracks down everything. So it's that whole planning piece and having something for the guys kept them organized, kept us organized. It's an incredible amount of organization, but it allows you to move and not get bogged down. That's the biggest thing. So you asked the question, what happens when you think you're ready? So, we've been waiting so long for the state to finally come through that for me, oh man, we've hit now, our goal is going to be achieved. For my wife, suddenly it was like, what? Wait a minute, these guys are leaving. So as we're looking for houses, I'm kind of getting support, but at the same time, I'm getting resistance, right? And then we found this place together and she was good, but it always felt like it was going to be 6 months away, 8 months away. Pretty soon, the night we closed, I was kind of handling everything myself, and I felt so much anxiety. I gave myself an anxiety attack, ended up in the ER. I was fine, but it was just like so much stress. And then after that, the one, you always got to look at a silver lining. What happened with COVID now, we've been able to paint the house. I'm cutting the grass once a week. Maureen's there. We've met the neighbors. We've transitioned the guys slowly. They're comfortable. Once we're finally in this house, we're going to feel good about it, And we actually have gotten to know, I said I called it the Irish ghetto because my neighbors are Maureen, Pat, Brian, and Terry. I said, what is this? And I said, here's Brian and Danny. Sean and Danny. So anyway, wonderful neighbors, and they're very supportive. One was a teacher who's taught I think she taught psychology at New Trier, and she's taught an autistic class and was supportive. The guy next door said anything we need. So we're getting comfortable that once the guys are over there, we're going to be fine. But it's the plan. It's the plan. I was always a planning guy anyway. Can you execute the plan? So it's kind of funny today, right? I made my notes. I brought out my sheets. I have the letter. I have the access schedule. I have the ARC letter. And I have the budget. That's what you need. You got to constantly look at the budget. And, you just kind of want to make sure that it doesn't overwhelm you, But I love what you said, Rich. Challenger, right here, I'm looking at Danny and my challengers. They're on a picture on the wall. We haven't even taken down the stuff yet. And that was a great, rewarding experience. Special Olympics. I can't swim very well, but my son Sean and Dan can swim because Special Olympics. I get the frog all the way across, 50-meter pool, and I'm like 10 meters, and I'm like, okay, I think I'll swim to the side. So anyway, just to wrap it up, it's what you really need to do is to just look ahead. Don't get it swallow you up. But just take those baby steps and feel like you got a sense of accomplishment and keep your eyes open. I love the idea of the retreat. We have some really, really close friends that kind of allow us to be sounding boards, and they don't have special needs, but they kind of guided us. And that's been a really important thing. We vacation with them and everything. They've taken our guys into their family and us into their family, or we take their guys into our family. And those are the kinds of things you need. Those are the kinds of things you need because you can't do it yourself. David, I think Rich, mentioned this Special Fathers Network. We may only have 6 or 7 tonight. You put it on. You don't know how important this is. I listened to Rich's podcast. I listened to a few of the latest ones. I feel bad because I decided I was going to go back from the front to back. No, when you put one out, I kind of drive when I'm driving the boys. I listen because I'll never catch up on that, But there's so many fascinating stories of so many parents and fathers and mothers that have done a good thing, And that's what we need. We need that information, that we need that to support our next decisions.
Well, Paul, thank you again. I'd like to open it up to others that might have a question. David Friedman.
Yeah, nice to see you, David. Paul, I actually am in a similar position to you. My son is 25 years old, has autism, and he just got pulled off the PUNS list like a month ago. So we live in DuPage County. So like a year behind you. Yeah, very excited about that. Absolutely. And I was wondering, with the house, so there's sort of the upfront capital cost of buying the house, and And then there's all the costs of kind of operating, it needs a new roof, it needs to have the grass cut, so I understand, coming up with the capital to buy it up front, but do you have to make arrangements for all the rest of that stuff to get paid for like ever?
Yeah, so the way it's really interesting. So imagine we've got three $87,000 awards. So it sounds like a ton of money. When you do the math between transportation, food, it's going to boil down to me getting $1,500 a month. Taxes alone, once again, beautiful Lake County. This little ranch house is 10 grand, in taxes. So the $1,500 is just going to go to taxes basically, and a few maintenance items. Your point is well taken. I created an LLC, a limited liability corporation, where I can run the house through the LLC. I'm charging the boys, they have ABLE accounts, and we've been able to put money in there. They got about 35,000 each in there. We're taking a couple $100. We don't really know what these additional costs are because we haven't lived there yet. But we're taking a couple $100 out in rent. Activisions doesn't want the house at all. So it's my house. I'm the landlord. I'm running all those costs. And I'd be glad to share any of that information with you, David, on how we built the model. Our lawyers were terrific. And I had my friends, my friend comes from 10 kids, and I think 20 of them, everybody had kids and they're all lawyers. So we had kind of a pro bono work on our drafting of our LLC, but putting it through the LLC allows us to run it like a business, to provides us with some good tax, relief and some of the costs that way. So that's kind of how we're operating the house. And I am charging a couple $100 a month to the other resident. And we're going to see how that goes. I mean, I don't even know if it's 200 too much, too little. We'll find out.
Yeah, great. I mean, offline, I would love to chat with you about it, because that's kind of the approach that we've been thinking that we're going to need to take to find a couple other families to buy a house together. And I'd love to hear about that in some more detail, more than sort of for tonight.
Yeah,
but
we had two guys, and we felt like if we could take ownership position and then just rent the room, that would give us a little bit, it's kind of the negotiation, David, you asked for with my wife, that we would have a little bit more control, for the guys. And since we had two guys, but we're at the Center for Enriched Living. I'm on their advisory board, and there's so many families looking to do something like this. The biggest thing that Rich pointed out is you have so much diversity in disability that to find compatible, just as you say, hell, let's throw 5 autistic guys together. I'm sure they'll have a good time, and it's not going to happen. And our guys are loving this house because it's got a family room, a living room. They each have a small bedroom and had a dormer. So they all have places to go to, when they want to kind of get away from each other and space out, So there's no cable TV. We still have VHSs and CDs, because that's what everybody's bringing to the house. God forbid those things go out. I do have the internet, but it's just funny. I got old TVs with the sliding VCRs, and when they go, we'll just get another one.
Well, Paul, thank you for sharing. Good question too, David. Al, Tom, did you have a question you'd like to pose?
Yeah, thanks. I have an 8-year-old, almost 9, with autism, so it feels a ways till he's even 22, but it's going to come fast. What did you do when you had 9-year-old sons with autism? How did you start getting ready?
Financial planner. Talk to David Hirsch. I mean, I have a financial planner. Her name is Marianne Ellert. It's Ellert Financial. But the only reason, Marianne had a disabled sister, so kind of committed her business around disability. And she kind of guided us on what we should be doing. The financial plan, which is standard to everybody, and also all of the different agencies, enrolling the guys in Medicaid, enrolling us and sharing with us that we need to talk to community alternatives, and these various agencies. And that just helped, right? Just to get the right people with that kind of information, because then as they grow, you're planning for them. So I would say a good financial planner, and if the financial planner doesn't have disability experience, at least get someone with disability experience along with your financial planner.
Any other questions before we wrap up?
I have a quick one for Paul. Paul, why did you choose the LLC versus a nonprofit 501c3 option?
I guess I just kind of was working with my tax guy, my planner. They recommended the LLC. A 501c3 probably would have been good, and we probably could have got funding for the house. I've had enough people that have said, is there anything we can do for you? And we've just kind of said, no, we're good. But long term, you have to think about, here's the other thing. With my company, I had always invested in the boys, and I had a special fund. So we bought this was a cash purchase. There's no mortgage, there's nothing. So we bought this house outright because we had planned for that. So the need for additional funding and stuff, that's why, David, I'm going to be able to kind of handle some of the other costs out of my own personal, and our whole disability trust is set up that way. The one thing we did not want to do is burden the other two guys. They're raising families, and they are the executors should my wife and I be gone. But then they're going to direct the funds. But we've kind of built everything around the fact that everybody's going to get a piece of the estate at some point, and this thing is pretty self-sufficient right now.
Okay, well, thank you again, gentlemen. A very enlightening conversation. And I'm very appreciative of your time and you leaning in on behalf of the Special Fathers Network. I'll mention that you heard a lot of reference to podcasts this evening. And Paul is actually a Special Fathers Network Dad to Dad podcast number 42. And Rich was actually a Special Fathers Network Dad to Dad podcast number 54. I think we just produced a number 111 this past week. They're coming out about once a week. If you haven't already subscribed, please do so. Like Paul is saying, that there's a rich resource of information there. And if you get behind, it's going to be hard to catch up because we're going to keep producing them. But I think of them, I'll be a little selfish. And what really motivates me to do some of this work is that I think of these interviews as rocket fuel. Right? These are some of the most inspirational and insightful stories that you're ever going to hear about fatherhood. They're not my stories. I'm just trying to shine a little light on some of these amazing stories of other fathers that are raising a child, or in some cases, children with special needs. So enough as far as plugging the podcast. This is a part of our bi-weekly series of Zoom calls that we're doing for dads on various topics. And the next topic is going to be on September 1st. And the topic is adaptive athletics. So I had a learning experience about a year and a half ago, early on. I'll just mention as sort of a preview that I was interviewing a guy by the name of Clayton Freck. Clayton has a son, Ezra. Ezra must be 12 or 13 now, and he was born without the use of his lower leg, and he only had one digit on his hand. So he had a toe-to-hand surgery when he was 2.5 years old. Now he's able to use his hand more functionally, and he has a prosthetic. So put the dad on a different path. He ended up quitting his corporate job, start something called the Angel City Sports Organization, and they put on the Angel City Games. They've been doing this for 5 or 6 years every June, well, up until this year. They didn't have the games just because of COVID. But I said something really I thought was just like a innocent question. I said, well, with the Special Olympics that exists in every state, and I know that Special Olympics in Southern California is super popular, I said, why would you be starting an organization that competes with Special Olympics? And he said, very politely, he said, well, as you know, Special Olympics is for people with intellectual disabilities. What we're talking about is adaptive athletics. And I said, well, I must be the last person to understand that, because that was not obvious to me. He said, well, no, in fact, most people don't understand that Special Olympics isn't for all people with disability. It's for people with intellectual disabilities. So to emphasize the point, we're going to be talking about next Zoom call is adaptive athletics, right? Which is when somebody is more physically impaired, not necessarily emotionally or
Like the
intellectually.
Paralympic Games, kind of like Paralympics, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So anyway, it'll be a fascinating topic. We have a number of dads within the network that have firsthand expertise in this, like Clayton, who's going to be one of our presenters. And I'm hoping that you can help spread the word to others. And anyway, the network is growing. I'm thrilled. And thank you again for your time this evening. And we hope that you can tune in when we do another one of the podcasts. So that's a wrap for tonight. And if anybody wants to stick around and talk like we do, sort of unofficially off the record, I'm happy to stick around for a few minutes just to communicate. And, David, if you want to follow up with Paul, I'm happy to, introduce you. You can probably find each other, just through the podcast. You both have done podcasts for that now.